Thank you, Peter. That was very nice. You didn't tell me that there were so many people here. So I have a sneaky suspicion that you're not here just to listen to me. So I'm going to be very brief, 13 minutes on a 300-page book. And I'm going to give you some background, and I'm going to give you some substance. The background starts with the title of the book. The title of the book is the first thing you see, but it's the last thing that we do. And when we put our heads together at Bloomsbury Press to create a title for this book, we thought about a number of alternatives to the one that you see. In a shameless attempt to capitalize on the notoriety of the Volcker rule among commercial bankers, I tried the semi-biblical Volcker, know thy enemy. Now, that was rejected as too narrow. I mean, how many commercial bankers are there? Fewer than before, we know that. Someone else suggested a much more expansive Volcker rules. And now, that was cute, and the fellow on my left, the tall one, he loved it. But it was knocked out because, as the poet says, too cute ain't cute. So instead, we took the title, The Triumph of Persistence. And that's because that describes how Paul Volcker did what he did. In researching this book, I had access to both the personal and the professional sides of Paul Volcker. He dumped into my lap the entire contents of a walk-in closet in his apartment, including the elementary school report cards that had been carefully preserved by his mother, Alma Volcker. He also authorized my reviewing his extensive Fed correspondence held in the archives of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Fed did not like that one bit. Federal Reserve makes the CIA look like publicity hounds. And finally, he sat for over 100 hours of interviews with me, and I'm sure you can guess it was not always happily. So now let me turn to some substance. This book is really two stories in one. It's a story about a man who served under 5 presidents, battling the 3 greatest financial crises of the last half-century. But it's really a story about trust. And what I'm going to do is first tell you a little bit about the crises and then go to the underlying theme. Crisis number 1 is gold. On August 15th, 1971, some of you may remember that President Nixon severed the final link between the dollar and gold by suspending foreign central banks' rights to exchange dollars for gold, which they could have done until now. Contrary to popular belief, this was Paul Volcker's idea. He was the Undersecretary of the Treasury for the Monetary Affairs at the time, and he calls this particular incident the single most significant event of his career. Crisis number 2, of course, is inflation. When the annual rate of inflation hit double digits in the first half of 1979, President Jimmy Carter appointed him chairman of the Federal Reserve Board over the strenuous objections of his advisors, who said that he was too independent and outspoken. I wonder where they got that idea from. 2 months later, Paul Volcker raised interest, changed the operating techniques of the Federal Reserve, raised interest rates to higher levels than the chairman himself thought. 15% on long-term U.S. Treasury securities, 20% on commercial loans to commercial banks, prime commercial banks, prime loans. Both are modern records that still stand. And crisis number 3 is, of course, the world financial crisis that began in 2007 and is still with us. Let me just say that the Volcker rule label was announced to the press by President Obama in January of 2010, caught Paul Volcker by surprise. Not the rule, but the label. In fact, when he heard the president announce his name, he thought to himself, now why did he do that? And that's why I say my favorite phrase in this book describing Paul Volcker is the man who could find fault with the Mona Lisa. Paul Volcker made a living saying no. He said no to gold in 1971. He said no to inflation in 1979. And he said no to commercial bank speculation in 2010. But the underlying theme, the underlying storyline is trust, which, by the way, is the title of the last chapter of this book. It is 6 pages. You can go directly there and you can skip all the stories if you want. When President Obama appointed him chairman of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board, PRAB, Carlo Ciampi, the former president of Italy, wrote Paul Volcker a 3-word letter. That letter still sits in a chrome frame on his desk. It says, "We trust you." And in this book, I show how Paul Volcker earned that trust and follow up with the lessons. And I'm going to start at the beginning. Paul Volcker learned about trust as a child. His father, Paul Volcker Sr., was the town manager of Teaneck, New Jersey from 1930 to 1950, and he had a quotation from George Washington hanging in a frame behind his desk. It's an obscure quote from a letter George Washington wrote to his officers, who at the time were getting applications from other people to be officers. And the quote says, "Do not suffer your good nature to say yes when you ought to say no. Remember that it is a public and not a private cause that will be injured or benefited by your choice." That quote worked its way into Paul Volcker's brain, and he's been saying no ever since. Paul Volcker is known today for the Volcker Rule, but he earned the trust that's synonymous with his name by standing up to the political pressure during the 1980s and defeating an inflation that almost destroyed the American financial system. Why is he obsessed with inflation? He is fond of blaming his mother, just like the rest of us, for all of our obsessions. And I say he has to stand in line for that. He's upset. He was upset because she refused to give him an increase in his allowance at the end of World War II in 1945 when he was leaving to go to Princeton to reflect the inflation of World War II. But in point of fact, the real reason he is obsessed with inflation is that he is obsessed with the honor of government service, perhaps because of his father. He believes that inflation undermines trust in government, the trust that the government will not abuse the right that we as citizens give the government to print money. I must tell you, this is a unique, overlooked, but perhaps the most fundamental reason for the evils of inflation. I'd never heard it before, and I've been studying inflation since I've been 7. Trust, in fact, brings me to the lessons of the book today. Americans have enjoyed the benefits of consuming more than we produce because the world uses the dollar as international money. People talk about reserves. It's international money. And there are many reasons for the dollar's supremacy, but the most fundamental is that investors trust us not to debase the currency by inflating. And that trust will be sorely tested going forward unless we get the long-term full employment budget under control. Now, I show in this book that Paul Volcker ultimately controlled inflation by refusing to monetize the Reagan-era budget deficits. The process began before, in October of 1979, when he changed the monetary procedures at the Federal Reserve, drove down inflation from 12% to 4% within 3 years. By 1982, inflation was down to 4%. But the final victory, certainly for interest rates, came only after Congress passed a balanced budget amendment in 1985. It was called the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Bill that imposed draconian cuts in government spending unless the government